I lived next to this one kid who always had bandages wrapped around his entire head, even covering his face. I remembered his name was Wilbur, a 12-year-old boy who never left his house. He sometimes looked out of his bedroom window on the top floor at all of the kids who would play outside, while Wilbur just sat and watched. I remembered his windows had metal bars on them, so there was no way he could climb out of his bedroom. We sometimes communicated with each other by writing on pieces of paper, since Wilbur couldn't hear me because his window was locked. Wilbur only did this when his parents weren't around, because they were weird. His mother and father were those kind of parents that were insanely crazy about science and chemistry. Well, according to Wilbur. They would stay in their basement and work all day and night, except for those times when they gave Wilbur some food daily. Now, they weren't treating him like an animal. It's just his parents were very busy. They told Wilbur that he shouldn't go outside or make contact with anyone until his face had gotten better. He told me that he'd accidentally slipped on one of his parents' chemicals and had fallen face first, ruining his appearance. And his parents feared that he would be made fun of by the other kids in the neighborhood. I remember one time, a couple of older kids were throwing rocks and pebbles at his windows, laughing and pointing at Wilbur as he looked down at them. He told me that they would do it a few times, but he'd gotten used to it. But to me, he was always a great guy, and still is today. I've never been inside his house, but he showed me some of the cool stuff he'd collected, like comic books. He had loads of them, from Marvel to DC to other non-superhero comics. He was a huge superhero fan though. He even said that he felt like a superhero. A normal human being who became affected by dangerous chemicals and then became a powerful superhero, he once wrote on the paper, and then put it up to his window as he pretended to be a superhero. I had a collection of action figures and video games that amazed Wilbur. He told me that he'd never played a single video game in his life, which was quite sad. He also told me that his babysitter had taken them away before he could play with them, and burnt them in front of his eyes. Wilbur had a mean babysitter named Miss Fitzgerald. A tall, nasty lady who never liked kids at all. This had started before his face had even become messed up, he told me. She was basically every kid's nightmare. At least, according to all the things he told me she's done. Miss Fitzgerald had babysat many kids before, and trust me, it was not pretty. Wilbur told me that the last kid she babysat, a 4-year-old girl, she made her live through 7 hours of hell. Wilbur said that Miss Fitzgerald had starved her and surrounded her bed with a few bear traps, and the worst thing that had happened, well, parents didn't know about her deed. She would lie to them just to get paid. From all the things I've heard, she is a foul, cruel woman with no soul at all. And now, she had to babysit this poor guy. Wilbur was old enough to make his own decisions, except for some, but his parents apparently hired this evil witch anyway. The parents had to go to Texas to a science convention, so Wilbur was left alone with her. One time, I was writing about her to show to him, but then I saw Miss Fitzgerald forcefully pulling him away from the window. One time, I was writing about her to show to him, but then I saw Miss Fitzgerald forcefully pulling him away from the window. And that was that. The rest of my day went by without talking to him. The next day, when I looked through my window to see Wilbur, I saw someone lying down on his bed. Looking at the person's wrapped head, I banged my fist on the window trying to get Wilbur's attention. He slowly sat up on his bed, wiping tears from his eyes, He seemed to be crying, which gave me a thought. I had a worried look on my face as I saw bruises all over his arms and legs, a faded dark tone of purple. He went to write something down on a piece of paper. Then, as Wilbur finished writing, he came up to the window and pressed the note on the glass. What he had written terrified me, the whole situation still burning in the back of my mind. Something I knew I could never forget. He had written, "Help me." What made it worse was that his handwriting was scribbled onto the paper and was almost illegible. Wilbur kept banging on the window with his other hand. And then, suddenly, I saw someone else run into his bedroom next to him. Yes, it was her. You know who. She was holding something in both of her big, chubby hands. In one hand was a lemon, and in the other was a pair of scissors. What Miss Fitzgerald did next terrified me even more. She ran up to Wilbur, grabbing his head, holding it still. I saw him screaming in pain and fear, so I knew I had to do something. At the same time, I couldn't stop watching. She used her scissors to cut open the bandages and unwrap them off of his head, and threw them to the side. What I saw almost made me vomit. Something so sickening. I was utterly shocked at looking at Wilbur's real, deformed face. His whole head was completely covered by bandages, and what was underneath, I suddenly knew the purpose of those bandages. I saw his face, almost melted off, showing a dark red layer underneath. I could only describe his face as looking like melted cheese on a cheeseburger. It was Wilbur's whole face. Even one of his eyeballs was burnt a bit. The chemicals had messed him up badly. Miss Fitzgerald sliced the lemon in half with her scissors, pinning Wilbur down on his bed. Then she threw the scissors to the side, next to the bandages, and held his head still with one hand. With the other hand, she squeezed a lemon slice onto Wilbur's head, into his eyes, into the red layer of his face. Oh, the painful expression on his face, his loud, muffled screams, his face stinging from the acid of the lemon juice. She used the other part of the lemon to squeeze onto his face again, torturing Wilbur with extreme pain. I decided to bang my fist on the window, which was a bad idea. Miss Fitzgerald just looked over to the bedroom window, right at me. I jumped back because she had noticed me. She ran back out of the bedroom, shoving Wilbur down as he screamed in pain and agony. I knew what she was going to do, so I ran out of my bedroom and ran downstairs. The good thing about this situation was that my parents don't know about Wilbur, coupled with the fact that they were at work for a little while. I locked the front door, hoping that Miss Fitzgerald wouldn't burst into my house. I looked around for the phone, but while I was doing this, a loud bang rang in my ears. I looked behind at the door, noticing her red, sweaty face and her curly blonde hair looking in. By the looks in her eyes, I knew there was going to be some trouble. She kept banging on the door, nearly screaming her head off. As I looked around for the phone, I finally found it, next to the couch on the coffee table. I ran towards it, dialing 911, as the sounds of her threatening screams could be heard from outside. After waiting for a few rings, I finally heard the operator's voice, the usual greeting from a 911 operator. I started explaining the whole situation from beginning to end, as quickly and as clearly as possible. They told me to wait patiently, as the police would arrive at my house soon. It took a few minutes for the police to arrive, and when they did, my parents also arrived earlier from work as well. Apparently, they had got a call from the police explaining my situation and decided to immediately come home. My parents were extremely worried and frightened. They asked me more questions than the police did. I had to explain everything, from being friends with Wilbur to how his parents had left him with an abusive babysitter to what she had done. About an hour later, a police officer came to me. He had something he wanted to tell me about the horrible atrocities that had taken place next door. The truth about the babysitter, the parents, and Wilbur was truly shocking. Based on the evidence they'd found, Wilbur's parents weren't his actual parents at all. They'd adopted him from an orphanage that's out of town, just so they could perform an experiment on him. It was the reason why they'd moved to Texas, to hide. The babysitter, Miss Fitzgerald, was part of the experiment too. In fact, Wilbur wasn't the first kid to get adopted by these scientists. They had done illegal experiments on these orphans, and it was to find out how much pain a child could take before death, based on the cause of death and the age of the child. 38 children between the ages of 2 and 13 had been reported missing, and Wilbur was one of them. There were security cameras on the outside and inside of the house. Then, they arrested Miss Fitzgerald for child cruelty and the deaths of so many children, and are now in the process of finding the 2 scientists. So, I was friends with someone who would have been killed if I hadn't called the police. Apparently, Wilbur also tried to lie about almost everything he told me. He was just trying to protect himself. He was sent to a new trusted family, a married couple who lived out of town. After that, I never saw him again. Well, until now. 20 years after that incident, I went to a bar to get myself a few drinks, when a man approached me. "Remember me?" he said. I smiled, realizing how long it had been since I last saw Wilbur. In fact, he now looks like a nice, healthy man, without his bandages. He's brown-haired with sky-blue eyes. And, to be honest, he almost looked like a complete stranger. After that, we talked and drank a few glasses of beer, finally speaking to each other in person. Wilbur and I knew that nobody would try to keep us apart, that the scientists and the babysitter are probably still locked away right now. And I keep thinking about that again and again. The fact that this man would have been killed if I hadn't saved his life.